The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the vast Arizona desert. Dust swirled in the air, and the dry, cracked earth seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Jake Thomas, a seasoned cowboy, was riding his horse across the barren landscape. He had been on the trail for days, his body tired and his mind focused on nothing but the road ahead. The constant hum of the wind and the distant call of a coyote were the only sounds that kept him company. Jake was used to the rough life of the West. He had spent years working cattle, riding from one job to the next and dealing with the everyday dangers that came with living in such a harsh environment. But even for someone like him, who had seen it all, the world was always unpredictable. Today, as he rode across a small valley, something caught his eye. A figure in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a mirage, a trick of the sun on the dusty horizon. But as he got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman. She was sitting on horseback, her posture straight and proud, yet something seemed off. Her horse appeared to be limping, and the woman herself was struggling to stay balanced. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he spurred his horse forward, heading toward her. As he approached, he saw that the woman was alone. Her face was darkened by the sun, and her clothes were weathered and torn. She was a Native American woman, dressed in simple, practical clothing. Her long black hair was braided down her back, and she wore no visible jewelry or adornment. But despite her rough appearance, there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a kind of determination that Jake could recognize immediately. "Need some help?" Jake called out as he reined in his horse. The woman looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if sizing him up. She didn't say anything at first, but her gaze was sharp and cautious. Jake could see that she wasn't thrilled to see him, but she was also clearly in no position to turn down help. Her horse limped a little more, and she winced as she shifted in the saddle. "I'm fine," she finally replied, her voice low but steady. "Just need to rest." Jake studied her for a moment. The horse was injured, and it was clear that they weren't going anywhere fast. The desert was unforgiving, and it would be dangerous for anyone to travel alone, especially with an injured horse. He knew she would need more than just rest. She needed help. "You're not fine," Jake said, his voice softer now. "You'll never make it like this." "Let me help," the woman hesitated. For a moment she looked as if she might refuse and ride off, but then, with a small sigh, she slid off the horse, her body moving stiffly as if the weight of the day had taken its toll. Jake quickly dismounted and stepped forward to assist her. "Careful, cowboy. You'll break me," she warned with a faint smile, her voice tinged with a hint of amusement. But even as she said this, Jake could see the weariness in her eyes. Jake smiled back. "I'm not about to break you, but I'm sure not leaving you out here." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I'm Ayla," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake," he replied, offering his hand. She took it briefly, her grip firm despite her fatigue. Together, they led her injured horse to a nearby rock outcropping, where Jake tied both horses securely. He knew they needed to take a break, and it would be better to rest before moving on. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and nightfall was approaching. Sitting down on a rock, Ayla seemed to relax a little. She didn't say much, but there was a sense of trust forming between them, small but undeniable. Jake took out a small pouch of tobacco and rolled a cigarette, then lit it with a match, watching the thin trail of smoke rise into the air. "What brings you out here?" Jake asked, his voice casual but genuinely curious. He could tell she wasn't just an ordinary traveler. Ayla hesitated before answering, her eyes focused on the horizon. "I'm from a small Apache tribe," she said slowly, as if testing the waters. "We've been running from the soldiers. They've been chasing us for days." Jake felt a sharp pang of sympathy. He knew all too well how the Apache had been treated by the government and soldiers, pushed from their lands, their way of life destroyed. It was a brutal time for anyone who wasn't part of the growing population of settlers or soldiers. "Chased by the soldiers?" Jake asked softly, his voice steady. He knew the history, he didn't need to be told the full story. Still, he wanted to understand her situation better. Ayla nodded, her expression hardening slightly. "We fought to keep our land, to keep our way of life, but now, we are the ones being hunted." She paused, her eyes flicking over to Jake. "I'm alone now. The others." "They didn't make it," Jake said nothing. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of her words, and he understood what she meant. Survival in the desert wasn't easy, especially with enemies at every turn. It wasn't just the soldiers they had to worry about. It was the betrayal, the constant fight for survival. He had seen it before in other parts of the West, but hearing it from her made it feel personal. "You're not alone now," Jake said quietly, looking at her. "Not if I can help it." For the first time since their meeting, Ayla gave him a small, appreciative nod. It was a gesture of acceptance, perhaps even trust. She might have been wary at first, but she had come to realize that Jake wasn't like the soldiers who hunted her people. He wasn't like the other men who had crossed her path. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, the silence between them settled into a comfortable quiet. The desert night was cold, but it felt safer here in this moment, and for now that was enough. As the days passed, Jake and Ayla grew more accustomed to each other's presence. The journey was still dangerous, and every day they faced new challenges. The harsh desert weather, the threat of soldiers, and the constant need for survival weighed on both of them. But something about the way they worked together began to create a bond between them, something unspoken yet deeply felt. Ayla was strong, more capable than Jake had initially realized. She could ride and navigate the desert with ease even though her horse was injured. She knew how to find water when it seemed there was none, how to hunt for food in the unforgiving landscape, and how to build a fire when the cold desert nights set in. Every skill she had learned was born from necessity, and Jake admired her for it. Jake in turn offered his knowledge of the land, his experience with horses, and his ability to track animals. Though Ayla was skilled in her own right, Jake's familiarity with the ways of settlers and the men who roamed the West often helped keep them safe. Over time, their skills complemented one another. She taught him some things about the desert, while he taught her things about the ways of the settlers and soldiers. The days were long and tiring, but at night, as they sat around the campfire, something shifted between them. They no longer spoke in short, clipped sentences, but shared stories, small pieces of their lives that helped them understand each other better. Jake learned that Ayla had once lived in a peaceful village, surrounded by family and friends. Her people had a strong connection to the land, a deep respect for the animals, and a culture that valued freedom above all else. But that peace had been shattered when the U.S. Army began pushing further into their territory. Ayla's family had fought fiercely, but many had died in the skirmishes that followed. "My father was a warrior," Ayla explained one evening, her voice soft as the firelight danced on her face. "He taught me how to ride and fight. He told me that one day I would have to defend our people, protect our land. But I never thought I would be running, always running." Jake listened quietly. He had known about the conflict between the U.S. government and the Native American tribes, but hearing Ayla's story made him realize how deeply personal it was. He had seen the Apache in the desert before, but he had never thought much about their lives, about what they had lost. Now he understood that they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for everything that mattered to them. "I can't imagine what it's like," Jake said, after a long pause, "to have everything you've known taken away." Ayla gave a small shrug, though her eyes were distant. "It's the way of the world now. We're always fighting, always on the move, but there's no place for us anymore." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. His own life had been hard in its own way, but it was different. He hadn't had to fight for his land. He hadn't been forced to run from his home. He realized for the first time just how privileged he had been in comparison. The following days brought new challenges. They had to move carefully through the desert, avoiding both soldiers and other Apache hunters. There was always the risk of being discovered. Though Jake had managed to stay under the radar, he knew that at any moment they could be spotted. One morning, as they were preparing to leave camp, Jake noticed a group of dust clouds rising in the distance. He squinted into the horizon and his heart sank. "Soldiers," he muttered under his breath. Ayla's eyes widened. She had learned to recognize the signs of danger quickly. "We need to move," she said urgently. "They're coming closer," Jake nodded. They quickly packed up their camp, taking only what they needed. Ayla's horse was still limping, but it could manage for a while longer. The two of them mounted their horses, ready to make a quick escape. Jake's mind raced as he considered their options. He knew the desert like the back of his hand, but so did the soldiers. "I know a place," Jake said, his voice steady. "A cave not far from here. We can hide there for a while." Ayla didn't hesitate. She trusted him, though the danger was great. Together they rode swiftly, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by the dry earth. The soldiers were still a good distance away, but Jake could feel the tension building. He glanced over at Ayla, who was focused, her face set with determination. Despite her exhaustion and the weight of their situation, she seemed as strong as ever. The hours passed and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert. They reached the cave just as night fell. Jake led Ayla inside, where the coolness of the rocks offered some relief from the heat of the day. They dismounted and tethered the horses, grateful for the shelter. "We'll stay here until it's safe," Jake said, his voice low. "We'll need to keep watch." Ayla nodded, but she didn't speak. She sat down near the entrance of the cave, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Jake sat beside her, his thoughts racing. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. The soldiers would search the area eventually, and they would need to move again soon. For now, though, they were safe. And for the first time since their meeting, there was a sense of peace between them. They had made it through another day together. They had survived. As they sat in the quiet darkness, the crackling of their small fire the only sound, Jake found himself looking at Ayla in a way he hadn't before. She had become more than just a woman he had helped out of the desert. She had become a partner, someone who was sharing in the struggle for survival. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a connection that had formed over the course of their journey. Ayla, too, seemed to sense the change. She looked at Jake, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. I wouldn't have made it this far without you." Jake smiled, though he didn't know how to respond. There was nothing more to say. The bond between them had already been forged in the fires of hardship and danger. They had each other's backs now, no matter what came next. The days blurred into each other as Jake and Ayla continued their journey through the unforgiving desert. They had become a team, each depending on the other for survival. The desert was harsh and the soldiers were never far behind. Every step they took felt like it was one away from danger, yet at the same time closer to it. But somehow, through the endless challenges, they had managed to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. It was late one evening when their luck began to run thin. The sun had just set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, and Jake and Ayla had stopped for the night near a small dry creek bed. They had made camp quickly, setting up a fire and preparing what little food they had left. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the stillness of the desert night. Jake sat close to the fire, sharpening his knife, while Ayla tended to the horses. There was something calming about the rhythmic sound of her movements. The way she stroked their coats and whispered soft words to them, she had a way with the animals. A calmness in her touch that made Jake think of the bond she had with nature. "Do you think we'll make it through the night?" Ayla asked quietly, her voice cutting through the silence as she finished with the horses. Jake looked up, his brow furrowed. He had been trying to stay calm, to hide the worry that gnawed at him. He had seen soldiers patrolling the area in the distance, and though they hadn't been spotted yet, he knew they couldn't afford to relax. "We'll make it," Jake said, though his words were more for reassurance than for certainty. "We just have to keep our wits about us." Ayla nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't as confident as she let on, and neither was he. The soldiers were getting closer, and sooner or later they would find them. That night, as the moon rose high in the sky, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind seemed louder than usual. His instincts told him something was wrong. "Stay close," Jake whispered to Ayla, his voice low but urgent. She moved closer to him, her face serious. "What's wrong?" "I don't know, but we need to be ready." Just as Jake finished speaking, the sound of hooves broke the stillness of the night. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. There was no mistaking it now. The soldiers were close, much closer than they had been before. They had found their trail. Jake's heart raced, and he quickly grabbed his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. Ayla, too, was already reaching for her bow, her movements calm despite the danger. "We can't outrun them," Jake said under his breath. "We need to hide." Without a word, Ayla nodded, and they moved quickly, leading the horses to a nearby patch of thick brush. They crouched low, keeping themselves hidden behind the foliage, their breath shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. The soldiers rode past them without noticing, their voices muffled by the distance. Jake held his breath, not daring to make a sound. He could hear them talking, laughing, their voices carrying in the night air. "Not much further, boys," one of the soldiers said. "We'll camp here for the night. I'm sure they're around here somewhere." Jake could feel Ayla tense beside him. She was barely able to contain her fear, and he knew it wasn't just because of the soldiers. It was the thought that they could be discovered at any moment, that their journey could end in an instant. "They'll leave by morning," Jake whispered, trying to calm her down. "We'll be fine. Just hold on." But as the night wore on, Jake's confidence began to waver. The soldiers were too close. There was no way they could stay hidden for long. And he didn't know how long Ayla could keep her composure. Finally, after what felt like hours, the soldiers dismounted and began setting up their own camp. Jake could see the firelight flickering in the distance, and he knew they had to make a decision. They couldn't stay hidden forever, but neither could they risk being discovered. "We have to move," Jake said quietly, his voice firm. "We can't wait for them to leave." Ayla nodded. She was scared, he could tell, but she trusted him. She always did. Without another word, they led the horses deeper into the brush, moving as quietly as possible. They had to get as far away from the soldiers as they could. Jake knew there was a cave nearby, a place he had passed through once, a small hidden shelter where they could rest for a while. It wasn't far, but the soldiers could still catch up with them. Every step was a risk. Just as they were about to make their move, one of the soldiers shouted in the distance. The voice was louder now, and it was clear that they had realized someone was nearby. Jake cursed under his breath. They had been spotted. "They've found us," Ayla whispered, her voice trembling. Jake's heart pounded as he grabbed Ayla's arm, pulling her to the side. "We're running out of time." Without hesitation, they took off, pushing the horses through the brush, desperate to make it to the cave. The sound of hooves grew louder behind them, and Jake knew they were being chased. They ran faster, their breath coming in quick gasps. Ayla's horse, though limping, pushed forward with determination, its legs pounding the ground beneath it. Jake's horse was faster, but the desert terrain was rough, and every step felt like an eternity. They made it to the cave just as the soldiers were getting closer. Panting and exhausted, they hurried inside, their bodies pressed against the cool walls of the shelter. The cave was small, but it would provide some protection for now. Jake looked at Ayla, his eyes filled with urgency. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Ayla nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They both sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the soldiers approaching. Outside, they could hear the clatter of hooves as the soldiers rode past the cave entrance, unaware of the two of them hiding inside. The minutes felt like hours. Jake's heart raced, and every small sound seemed to make his nerves flare. He could hear the soldiers searching nearby, calling out to one another, but they never came close enough to find the cave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the soldiers began to move on. Their voices faded into the distance, and Jake let out a long breath of relief. They had made it through another close call. Ayla, too, seemed to relax, though the fear in her eyes hadn't entirely faded. They were safe for now, but Jake knew that they couldn't stay here long. It was only a matter of time before the soldiers would come back, and next time they might not be so lucky. The morning light broke through the cracks in the cave entrance, casting a faint glow over the two figures huddled inside. Jake sat with his back against the cool stone, his face drawn and tired. He hadn't slept much the night before, his mind constantly racing with thoughts of the soldiers. Ayla, too, had been awake, though she kept her thoughts to herself. The weight of their situation had grown heavy on both of them, but they couldn't afford to show it. Jake stood and stretched, the muscles in his back aching from sleeping on the hard ground. He stepped out of the cave to survey their surroundings, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The desert, once a place of quiet beauty, now felt like a vast, empty prison. The air was dry, the sun already beginning to rise higher in the sky, and the faintest sound carried for miles in every direction. Jake knew they couldn't stay in the cave forever. They needed to move again to keep going, but where? Ayla joined him, standing beside him in silence. Her face was serious, her dark eyes focused on the distance. The time for running was wearing thin. Every decision they made now could be the difference between life and death. "We need to go," Jake said quietly, turning to Ayla. "We can't stay here much longer." Ayla nodded, but she didn't move right away. "Jake, we can't keep running. It's wearing us both down. The soldiers will keep looking for us. We need a plan." Jake knew she was right. They couldn't keep running forever, not at this pace. His heart was heavy with the weight of their journey, but he refused to give up. He had made a promise to her, and he intended to keep it. "I've been thinking about that," he said, his voice low. "I know a place. It's a little further to the north, hidden deep in the hills. It's an old abandoned settler's cabin. We can rest there, Maybe even find some supplies. Ayla looked at him, her brow furrowing with skepticism. And what if the soldiers find it first? Jake hesitated, his mind weighing the possibilities. It's a risk, but it's our best shot. We can't survive on the run forever. Ayla didn't say anything for a long time, her eyes searching the desert landscape. Finally, she nodded. We go then. With no more words spoken, the two of them set off once again. The desert, though beautiful in its own way, was relentless. The heat of the day grew unbearable as they rode on. The horses' hooves kicking up the dry dust beneath them, they kept their pace steady, moving quickly but cautiously, watching for any signs of danger. For hours, they rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Jake couldn't help but notice how much Ayla had changed since they first met. She was no longer the wary stranger who had refused his help in the beginning. She had become something more, a partner, someone he trusted with his life. Every time they faced danger, they did it together. And every time they survived, their bond grew stronger. But as they neared the hills, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air seemed thicker and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was off. He turned to Ayla, his eyes scanning the horizon. Stay alert, he murmured, his voice low. Ayla nodded, her grip on her bow tightening. She had learned to trust Jake's instincts. And she could feel it too now, the sense of unease that lingered in the air. They reached the hills as the sun began to set, the coolness of the evening bringing a welcome relief from the heat. Jake led them off the main trail, taking a path that only someone familiar with the land could navigate. The cabin was hidden deep in the hills, tucked away in a small valley where the rocks and trees made it nearly invisible from above. When they finally arrived, Jake dismounted and led Ayla to the small abandoned cabin. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging in places, but it was still standing. It was a safe haven, at least for now. Inside, they found remnants of the old settler's life. An old stove, a few broken chairs, and some tools scattered around. The place was empty, but it would do. They would be safe here for the night, and perhaps even for a few days if they were lucky. Ayla sat down on the floor, her back against the wall, and Jake began to gather what little supplies they could find. There was a small cupboard, and inside they discovered a few cans of food that had been left behind. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get them through the next few days. As Jake worked, Ayla studied him. She had never said it out loud, but she knew how much this journey was taking from him. He wasn't just physically tired. The weight of their struggle was beginning to show in the lines of his face, in the way his shoulders slumped as he worked. She had seen the same signs in herself, but Jake had always been the one to keep them moving, to keep them going. Now she could see that even he was beginning to lose hope. Jake, she started softly, her voice hesitant. He looked up, meeting her eyes. We can't keep running, Ayla said again, her voice firm now. You said you'd stand by me, and I've stood by you. But it's breaking us. Jake didn't answer right away. He knew she was right, and he had been thinking the same thing for days. They couldn't outrun the soldiers forever, and they couldn't keep hiding in caves or abandoned cabins. Something had to change, but he couldn't bring himself to say it, couldn't bring himself to admit that they were at the end of the line. I won't leave you, Jake finally said, his voice quiet but determined. We're in this together, Ayla. I'll find a way out. I promise. Ayla nodded, but the doubt in her eyes remained. She knew the risks they were taking, and she knew that the promise Jake made might be impossible to keep. But she didn't want to give up either. She couldn't. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The silence between them stretched, the weight of unspoken fears hanging in the air. They had survived so much already, but the hardest part was still ahead of them. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, they both understood that survival wasn't just about running away. It was about facing the truth and making the difficult choices that came with it. The sun had set by the time they finished preparing what little they had. The cabin was quiet now, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind outside. As Jake sat beside Ayla, he knew that their time here was limited. The soldiers would come sooner or later, and they would have to face them. But for now, at least, they had each other. And that was enough to keep them going. The days that followed were filled with tension. Jake and Ayla had taken shelter in the abandoned cabin, but they knew it wouldn't be long before the soldiers found them. The calm they had felt the night before was slowly being replaced by a gnawing fear. Every crack of a twig, every distant sound made Jake's heart race. He had always been able to rely on his instincts, but this time he wasn't so sure. For the first time in weeks, Jake allowed himself to rest. The journey had worn him down, and his body ached in places he didn't even know existed. But even as he slept, his mind never stopped. He was constantly thinking about their next move. How could they escape? Where could they go? Ayla, too, was on edge. She hadn't spoken much since they arrived at the cabin, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She was tough, she had to be, but the strain was starting to show. The fear of being caught, of losing everything, had taken its toll on both of them. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Jake stood outside the cabin, his eyes scanning the distant hills. It was then that he heard it, the unmistakable sound of horse hooves. His heart skipped a beat. They were coming. The soldiers were getting closer. "Ayla," Jake said urgently, his voice low but filled with fear. "We've got to move now." Ayla was beside him in an instant, her eyes wide. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Jake replied. He didn't waste any time. He quickly grabbed what little gear they had, and they hurried to the horses. The soldiers weren't far, and they had no time to lose. The tension was palpable as they rode out of the cabin's hiding place. The horses were tired, but they pushed on, their hooves pounding the dry earth beneath them. The desert was an endless expanse, and Jake's mind raced as he tried to figure out where they could go. He had one place in mind, a small canyon he had passed through years ago, a place that was hidden enough to give them some time to think. It wasn't far, but the soldiers could still catch up. They rode hard, not daring to look back. The sound of hooves behind them grew louder, and Jake could feel the weight of the chase closing in. The soldiers were getting closer, and they had no way of knowing how many were following them. Jake pushed his horse harder, urging it to go faster. Minutes felt like hours. The sun was setting and the shadows grew longer, but Jake didn't dare stop. The canyon was just ahead. He could see it in the distance. But just as they were about to reach it, a shout broke through the silence. "Stop right there!" Jake froze. The voice was loud, commanding, and full of authority. It was one of the soldiers, and they were too close. Jake's heart sank. Ayla turned to look at him, her face pale with fear. She didn't have to say anything. They both knew what they were facing. Jake's mind raced as he weighed his options. There was no time to outrun them now. He had to make a choice, and it was a dangerous one. "We need to fight," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. Ayla didn't hesitate. She nodded once, her hand reaching for her bow. Jake drew his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. The soldiers were closing in fast, and there was no way they would survive if they didn't act now. The first soldier came into view, his rifle raised. Without thinking, Jake fired. The shot rang out across the desert, and the soldier fell from his horse, a look of surprise on his face. But there was no time to celebrate. The other soldiers were right behind him, and they weren't going to give up that easily. Ayla fired her bow, hitting one of the soldiers in the shoulder. He staggered, but he didn't fall. He raised his rifle and fired back. Jake ducked, the bullet missing him by inches. The two of them were surrounded, but they kept fighting. Every shot counted, every moment was a battle for survival. Jake knew they couldn't keep this up for long. They had to escape somehow. Just as the soldiers closed in on them, Jake made a decision. "Ayla, we need to split up," he said quickly. "I'll take them to the right. You go left. We'll meet at the canyon." "Go," Ayla didn't argue. She nodded and spurred her horse to the left, disappearing into the desert. Jake turned his horse to the right, riding hard, hoping that the soldiers would follow him. He heard the sound of hooves behind him and knew that Ayla was making her escape. But just as he reached the edge of the canyon, a shot rang out. Jake's horse stumbled and he was thrown to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him and he lay there for a moment, dazed. He looked up to see the soldier who had shot him approaching, rifle raised. For a moment, everything slowed. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. But he was too slow. The soldier raised his rifle, ready to take the final shot. But just before the soldier could fire, there was a loud thud. The soldier fell to the ground with a grunt, a shaft from Ayla's bow sticking out of his chest. Ayla had returned. "Jake, get up," she shouted, pulling him to his feet. Jake barely had time to respond. They both ran for the canyon, their hearts pounding in their chests. The soldiers, realizing what had happened, began to chase after them. They didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. The canyon loomed ahead, a dark, narrow passage that would provide some cover. They rode hard, pushing their horses through the rocky terrain. The soldiers were still behind them, but they were slowing down, unable to keep up in the rough landscape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake and Ayla reached the safety of the canyon. They dismounted and hurried deeper into the narrow passage, the sounds of the soldiers' pursuit fading away behind them. They had made it. For now they were safe, but Jake knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more dangers to face. But for the first time in days, he felt a sense of relief. They had survived, and they would continue to fight, together. As they rested in the canyon, Ayla looked at Jake, her eyes soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I thought we were done for." Jake smiled, his expression weary but sincere. "We're not done yet, Ayla. Not by a long shot." And with that, they settled into the canyon, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.